So we are in our series on Revelation while they try to find my presentation. And we are in our second segment with chapter 1, which was the things that are. And that had to do with the vision the things that John had seen, that had to do with the vision that he saw in the early verses of Revelation chapter 1. And that's an important segment of Scripture for us to realize, because that's Jesus as he is right now. And so many of us focus on Jesus as he was in the past, in his life model lived during his earthly ministry. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to pair that with who he is today, where he's at today, how he presents himself today. So that was the first segment of our study of Revelation. And then the second segment is the things that are. And that is chapters 2 and 3. That's letters to the 7 churches that are in Asia Minor province. We are at. So we're going to call this one The Price of Destiny. But first, let's review your homework from the previous week, because we gave quite a bit out. You were assigned to read chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation. We're going to keep doing that again and again because we want you to understand these 2 chapters. Then, as we did with the letter to Ephesus, I told you to outline the letter to Smyrna we're going to be talking about this morning and dealing with that letter. And by outline, I mean find those 7 features that we've said every book or every letter has. We broke the first one down in Ephesus last week. And then I said contrast the Olivet Discourse according to Matthew 24 and Matthew 21. Now, we may not go so far into that this morning, but it is from a standpoint of prophecy, and Revelation is a book of prophecy, a sermon by Jesus or a teaching by Jesus that needs to be understood. And a lot of people make the mistake of believing that Matthew 24 and Luke 21 are identical, and they're not. So we told you to outline that. And every time I turn around, there we go. Then I said, disprove the following statement if you can. I submit that you can. We are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than any other period in history, including the time when Jesus walked the shores of Galilee and climbed the mountains of Judea. And that's kind of an ongoing assignment for you. It's not going to go away. By means of a very short review, there are 4 levels of application to the letters of these 7 churches. Some people, some theologians disagree with that. We're going to present it in that way. You can decide for yourself. The first level we call the local application. And by that, we mean that these were real churches in real cities. Any doubt of that was laid to rest with the work of Sir W.M. Ramsay, famous Scottish historian who lived between 1851 and 1939. He became so overwhelmed with the evidence of Luke as a historian and John as a historian that he went from atheism to Christianity based on, accurately, the Bible recorded its history. So these are real churches that Jesus was speaking to that were facing real problems at their time, and that's why we take a session to look at the historical background of each church to prove that. The second level of application is admonitory. Each letter's message applies to each church to some extent, and we want to be able to understand that it's to read the letters to the churches. The letter cards, any church can be mapped somewhere across these 7. The ones that thought they were doing good often found out they were not. The ones that thought they were not doing so hot found out they were doing good in the sight of the Lord. The third level of application is the personal. What do these 7 letters mean to us? How do we apply them to our lives today? Because every church has that phrase in it, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is. And of course, if you check the side of your heads, all but a very slim few of you have an ear on either side. We're supposed to be listening to this. Lastly is the 4th level, which is a prophetic application of the churches. This would not be true if these churches were in any other order or if they had any other names, but the letters lay out the history of the church. They fill in the gap implied by Daniel 9:26, Acts tells 30 years of the church, and Revelation 2 and 3 tells the history of the next 2,000 years. That is the premise that we are building over these course of weeks. So let's talk about the history and the background of the city of Smyrna and its church, so we can make ourselves comfortable with this. Again, where was Smyrna? Well, it was in the same region that we had Ephesus, that region called Asia, but not Asia as we think of it in modern geography, which would be, over here. But to the Romans, Asia was the western part of Turkey. Today, Smyrna is a city called Izmir, and it is the third largest city in all of Turkey. Izmir city has a population of 2.9 million, while Izmir province has a total population of about 4.3 million people. So it's a very populated area today. The modern city exports tobacco, grapes, figs, cotton, etc. And there was a lot of crops that came out of the ancient city as well. You can see here that Ephesus is here on the map, and then Smyrna was just a bit north. So Ephesus was here, Smyrna was here. In New Testament times, the city had a population of approximately 100,000 people, which was large for a city of the time. Smyrna possesses an excellent harbor. It was a very safe harbor. You had to come up around this peninsula and come in here to get to it. It was a bit more exposed. Smyrna possesses a lot of cypress-clad hills that also protected the city during those ancient times. If we want to take a look at its ancient history, we'll have the early pagan period, the Greek and Persian city-state period, and the period where it was Roman-controlled. Early on, the area was inhabited by the Leleges with later Hittite influences. It goes back to about 3000 BC. Around 1100 BC, Aeolian colonists from Cyme settled in Smyrna. And then the Ionians captured the city, and it spends the next few centuries as a Greek colony. In fact, according to Herodotus, the area fell into Ionians from Colophon, and there commenced the most glorious phase of Smyrna's history. During that period, the poet known as Homer was born, lived, and died in the city of Smyrna. That's where he was from. In approximately 687, King Eliades conquers and destroys Smyrna, making the territory part of the Lydians, and no city would exist in the region for 300 years. So the centuries of greatness ended by this attack of the Lydians. First, it was an expedition under a general name of Gyges, and he was defeated and driven back by the Ionians. But the one I mentioned a moment ago was totally successful. Smyrna was devastated, and the city died. It was the pathetic end to a history of 1.5 millennia. And that's one of the things that makes Smyrna as a city unique among history, because it was a city that died, or that lived and was prosperous, died, and then in a sense was resurrected to become a city again, which cannot be said for many places throughout history, especially in the ancient world. So, in response to a dream in the 4th century, somewhere around 333 BC, Alexander the Great orders one of his 4 generals, Lysimachus, to build a strong and well-planned city, the most beautiful in all of Ionia, which became known as the flower of Ionia. And it prospered into one of the greatest cities in the known world. So Smyrna was reborn. About 196 BC, Smyrna becomes an ally of Rome. Smyrna builds a temple to Dea Roma, which is the spirit or the deification of the spirit of Rome. And from 27 BC, when it came under the control of the Romans, she proved herself a faithful ally during the Syrian and Mithridatic Wars from 27 BC to 324 AD. Smyrna enjoyed great material prosperity. Strabo described it as the most beautiful city in the world. And eventually, Smyrna wins the right to build a temple to the Emperor Tiberius, who was emperor of the Roman Empire when Jesus was born. So they were very early adopters of emperor worship. Let's talk about the geography of Smyrna for a bit. Smyrna is 42 miles north of Ephesus, and Smyrna stood at the entrance of a broad, fertile valley called Myrmis, and it was at the mouth of the river Meles. It was strategically placed for trade between Europe in the west and in the east, and Smyrna was a rival to Sardis and the Lydian kingdom in its day after its rebirth. So it had a strategic position. The Hellenic or the Greek city of Smyrna possessed an excellent double harbor. This is the ancient city, this yellow line on your screen. And part of the original harbor was this purple line on your screen. And now that has become silted in. The outer harbor was a deep water mooring ground that could handle large ships. And the inner harbor, which is now silted in, had a narrow entrance that could be blocked by a massive chain that they would drag across it, therefore making it impenetrable to invaders. We can still see today some of the medieval fortifications, a cistern from the area of the Byzantines, meaning after Constantine moved the capital of Rome, after 312 AD. There's a tower from the ancient city that still rests there. In the reign of Tiberius, the city was almost blotted out by a devastating earthquake. And between 178 AD, the city suffered a succession of seismic disturbances, which again reduced the city to ruins. So Smyrna as a city is a city that suffered what you could call death or persecution again and again and again and again as part of its historical experience. Now, this is a fairly old photograph of Smyrna. You can see this hill. I'll show another picture of it in a minute. But this is some of the fortifications of an old Roman fort at the top of the hill. Emperor Marcus Aurelius once more restored it. And parts of the new agora are still standing to this day. In 378 AD, flashing forward past the time of Constantine, another earthquake demolished the city, but the intrepid Smyrnians again rebuilt. Today, bustling Izmir, that's the modern city, has been called the Paris of the Levant. So Smyrna as a city, this is a rendering of how it existed once upon a time, was richly embellished with temples and splendid buildings, and the perfection and symmetry of those buildings that surrounded Mount Pagos resulted in calling this the crown of Smyrna. So the city was below at the harbor, and then you went up the mountain, and the fortifications that were up there became known as the crown of the city. At the foot of the mountain stood the temple of Zeus, the father of the gods, and he was reputed to be the lord of the sky, rain, clouds, and thunders. And amidst these great streets, one of the streets was called the Gold. And this street, if you were to walk down and amid the buildings, it was lined with shrines of Apollo, the sun god, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, Asclepius, the goddess of medicine and healing. Various other deities were all lined up on the streets. And as you got closer to the sea, you came to where the goddess Cybele. She was a Phrygian nature goddess. At the agora, or the common square, kind of like the place where most commerce would take place in an ancient city, the commercial and political center, if you will, were statues of Poseidon, the sea god, and Demeter, the goddess of corn. So they had all of these deities in the city. The question becomes, how did they worship? And this is going to be how the letter spells out in the 7 features that we'll look at. The priests to all of these different deities wore crowns. And these priests were called Stephanophori. And that was a reference to the laurel or golden crowns which they used to wear in their public processions. So the priests, when they were having a service to one of their deities, would walk down this golden robe, and the thing that made them stand out as the priest were these golden laurel crowns that they wore on the top of their head. So a crown was a prize to the citizens of Smyrna, both because their city was crowned atop Mount Pagos with its fortifications, and because their priests wore it. They're awarded this honor at the end of their year in office, and in Revelation 2:10, when it says crowns are given to the overcomer, the Greek word used there is literally estephanos, or the type of crown that the pagan priests received for their service. So it was something that the people at the church of Smyrna would have been very familiar with. It was a part of their culture. So the priests wore crowns that corresponded to a flower of their patron deity. So we see the crown on top of Mount Pagos. We see the laurel crowns that the priests wore. But as I said, as they got closer to the water, the worship began to focus around Cybele, the god of their city. She began as Cybele under Phrygian, later gets renamed in Greek Re, the daughter of the sky and earth, and the mother of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Her worship was very wild, exuberant, and unrestrained. It has hints at a background very similar to the mother goddess from Ephesus. At the top of her head, if you even look at her head in the picture here, you can see she's wearing a crown, but it's not just a crown. It's hard to find renderings that demonstrate this, but her crown is a crown of towers or a crown of buildings. She is the goddess of urban life in its day. She was the goddess of human civilization at its peak. She was wealth, and she became recognized in the great cities as the goddess of settled life as opposed to urban life in the wilds where you didn't have commerce and you had to hunt. Her crown was of walled cities. And she appears on Smyrnian coins depicted as enthroned and wearing a crown of battlements and towers. Why? Because that says we are safe. You can't get into where we are at. And you have to think that from a public relation, a city like Smyrna had to be very interested in telling its citizens they were safe because it was a city that died and got destroyed over and over and over again. Safety was a farce because it didn't matter how many fortifications they built, they were constantly knocked down. It is possible that she's alluded to in Daniel 38, even though it doesn't quite say goddess there, but the text says a god of forces. In the Hebrew or the Aramaic there in Daniel, it's much more likely a goddess of fortresses. So she could have been alluded to even in those early times. Now, if we were to define in modern times what Smyrna worshipped, well, we could say that Smyrna was a city with a lot. Clubbing was a thing. And the modern worship of Cybele could be seen in what, the young people look for in big city nightlife. Modern comfort and pleasure reigns. Drunkenness, lewdness, and promiscuity abound. This can be seen in the music of the scene. So you begin to get a picture of what life was like in the city, but there was one other component to worship in Smyrna that was absolutely essential to their lifestyle. As I said early on, they became an ally of Rome, and in addition to the usual deities, Smyrna was one of the first cities to the concept of the deification of the emperor. In 196 BC, the Smyrnans erected a temple to Dea Roma, which was the goddess of Rome, and they subsequently built one to the emperor himself, Tiberius. The worship of the emperor became compulsory. In other words, you didn't have a choice. Each year, a Roman citizen had to burn just a pinch of incense. You'd have to walk up to and there would be a bowl full of incense, and you would have to take a pinch of incense, and you would have to put it into the fire, and it would poof and smoke and ignite. And that was acknowledging publicly that Caesar was the supreme Lord. And in return, that citizen would receive a formal certificate stating that he had done so. So if it was ever questioned, he could pull out his certificate and say, I kissed the ring, I acknowledge Caesar as Lord over all. Originally, this action was intended simply as a proof of political loyalty, since the individual was permitted to worship whatever god or goddess he chose once he had made this offering to Caesar. This was a means of unifying and integrating the vastness of the empire. But it became compulsory. And after it became compulsory, those who refused to burn that pinch of incense were put to death. So you can imagine then how this became difficult for Christians. This act of worship presented a vital for any Christian, and many who refused to offer that simple pinch of incense and say that Caesar was the supreme Lord were burnt at the stake or perished at the fangs of wild beasts in the arena. Because, see, biblically, Jesus Christ is the supreme Lord. And if you follow him, anybody else was, and these Christians took that seriously, to the point that their lives depended on it. So, somewhere around 169, maybe as early as 155 AD, the bishop of Smyrna, a man by the name of Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of John, refused to recant that Jesus was the supreme Lord and would not put that pinch of incense into the altar to acknowledge Caesar as a deity. And as they took him to the stake, he said, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me wrong. How can I now speak evil of my king who saved me? The old man was burned at the stake on the Sabbath day. Okay. My mouse is being funky. There we go. He was burned at the stake on the Sabbath day, which was an object of Jewish hatred as well as Roman persecution. So Christians in Smyrna paid a great, great price. Let's look at the later history. We saw that Smyrna suffered many tragedies, but was never destroyed again. In the 30s AD, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Smyrna was almost blotted out by an earthquake. 178 to 180 AD, during these 2 years, the city suffered a succession of earthquakes, but each time refused to be destroyed. Elias once more restoring it, and parts of his agora still stand to this day. 378, as we said, another earthquake rocks the city, demolishing it. But the intrepid Smyrnians again rebuilt. They were not going to be destroyed again. They knew what it was like to be wiped from the face of the earth for 3 centuries. They weren't going to let it happen. Moving all the way forward to the Middle Ages, 1402 AD, Tamerlane besieges the lower city, which was held by the knights. Their stronghold was overcome, and the city falls into Turkish, aka Muslim, hands. Later in the 80s, the natural process of the silting up or the filling up of the harbor goes unchecked until the modern times. In the late 19th century or the 1800s, the Christian element has always been strong, and at this time still outnumbers the Muslims 3-1. The Turks call the citadel Smyrna because there were so many Christians in the city in the 1800s. And as we said today, the city still thrives. So, what are your key takeaways to think about before we apply the letter in the next session? Well, first off, was literally a city that was dead and is alive. Smyrna was literally a city and a church that refused to be destroyed by great trials. These are the things that W.M. Ramsey saw as he invested the literal history of these places, and it convinced him that the Bible had to be truth because he traveled to these places and uncovered it and realized the letters that John said Jesus wrote to these churches literally applied to the people that lived there. The Smyrnians knew what it was to be faithful to their Roman masters, even amidst hard times. He was the god of the city, and her worship reflects the idolatry of modern comfort. All that was required of a Roman citizen to show honor to Caesar was a pinch of fire in incense. Very key point. Smyrna has never suffered a second destruction that was final. You're going to see that that plays into the letter itself in very powerful ways. Now, before we begin to apply the letter, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail because it really deserves a session unto itself, but because this is a topic that we need to get familiar with, I want to do just a little addendum, just talk about the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and Luke 21, for just a bit. And that's because I've assigned you to study those chapters. And so after I kind of give you this breakdown, if you tried in this past week to kind of outline some of the differences you saw in those chapters, take some of what I'm going to tell you now, and as we will always do with these sessions, we'll post some of these slides after Michelle gets everything edited and cleaned up, which you guys should always be grateful for the time that she spends doing all of that. She had 3 hours or more on just one little piece of it this past week, days sometimes. So, but take the slides that I'm going to give you here and compare it to your notes so that when we do, I almost said do, when we do a full session on this, yes, I'm immature, I know it. When we do that, you'll be just a little bit familiar. In other words, I'm preparing you ahead of time. I'm trying to get you used to looking at certain pieces of Scripture ahead of time. One of the things you want to make yourself familiar with is that when we're speaking of Bible prophecy, Israel has a total of 3 temples. So you're going to get used to hearing the first temple, the second temple, and the third temple. Now, biblically speaking, that can be confusing to people because Moses, he had a mobile temple to speak called the tabernacle. And that was, in the days post the Exodus from Egypt, and that was a tent, it was erected. That's not considered one of the temples from a prophetic standpoint, okay? Then, after that, thank you, Hawk. After that, resources allocated by David in his life, even though the blood that was on his hand from the murder of Bathsheba's husband prevented him from building it himself, Solomon built what is known as the first temple. So the first temple is Solomon's temple. That temple is destroyed by the Babylonians around 586 BC, and it is not until the return during the period of Ezra and Nehemiah that we see the second temple. And then that can be a little bit confusing to people because that temple is called Herod's temple. Well, Herod wasn't even born for centuries. Why is it his temple? Because even though Nehemiah and Ezra oversaw the building of the second temple, it was in the time of Christ or just prior to the time of Christ when Herod embellished that temple, really made it one of the wonders of the world of its day, practically 22 stories tall, if you can believe that, okay? And that was the temple that was around in Jesus' day. In fact, when the disciples said, "Look upon these stones," and Jesus said, "Not one of these stones will be left upon another," it was Herod's temple. So Herod's temple was built by Ezra, but embellished by Herod. That's the second temple, okay? Now, of course, there takes place in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes around 167 AD, where Judaism is outlawed inside of Israel, and an idol to Zeus is erected inside the Holy of Holies. Now, granted, at this time, there was never any glory or Shekinah glory in the second temple. That existed only in Solomon's temple. It departs from Solomon's temple in the book of Ezekiel, prior to its destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, and the glory of God and the Ark of the Covenant never exist in Herod's temple. They're never there. So you didn't have the kind of retribution for going into the Holy of Holies in Herod's temple that you did in Solomon's day. So they erect this idol to Zeus in the Holy of Holies, and that becomes known as, to the Jews of that day, the abomination of desolation. It was such an abomination to have an idol to a pagan god inside the holiest of holies for their god. They named it the abomination of desolation. But of course, when we get to the subject of prophecy, that really becomes abomination number 1. Then there's a remodel, okay, around 19 BC. That's when Herod begins to embellish this thing. And in 70 AD, the destruction by Titus, Vespasian's son, comes, they wipe out the temple, and it's reduced to rubble, and no further temple is there. But Jesus, in these Olivet Discourses, Matthew 24 and Luke 21, he said, you will know these things start to happen, especially in Matthew, he mentions the abomination of desolation. Well, the problem is an abomination of desolation cannot have happened in Jesus' day. It cannot have happened when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, because the Jews knew what an abomination of desolation was. That was when a pagan idol was erected in the Holy of Holies. Well, you can't have a pagan idol erected when there is no temple. So what does that mean to us? It means, prophetically speaking, there has to be a third temple. There's a temple institute in Jerusalem this very day that is working to build the furniture and the artifacts that the implements that need to be ready for that temple. And one day on the Temple Mount, there is going to be a new temple resurrected. That is one of the signs that the end times time scheme is beginning to happen. And according to that, there will be a second abomination of desolation that takes place in that temple, and that is what begins to trigger some of the events that Jesus prophesies in Matthew 24. So it's just something that I want you to be aware of, because we're going to discuss a lot of that stuff in coming sessions, but I don't want it to hit you kind of upside the head. In Matthew 24, verse 6, it says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Everybody who's tried to shoehorn every dangerous thing that's ever happened in history into the coming of the Antichrist, Jesus said, no, all these things have to happen, but the end hasn't begun yet. And then in the very next two verses, he says, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places." And this is a very important line. He says, "All these things are the beginning of sorrows." That is a group of signs, and that is important, because this group of signs exists in all four of these books. They exist in Matthew, they exist in Mark, they exist in Luke, and they exist in Revelation. And you can see there, false Christs are mentioned, wars are mentioned, famines are mentioned, death is mentioned, martyrs are mentioned, global chaos is mentioned. The reason we don't talk about Mark chapter 13 when we do this study is Mark's account is virtually identical to Matthew's. So we consider them basically one account. Okay? Luke's account, that's why I have it highlighted in orange on your screen, has some inherent differences, and that's why I wanted you to get familiar with the differences between those two texts. One of the key differences is after this group of signs, Matthew says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will be offended and will betray one another." And if you progress a little bit further for time's sake, Matthew 24:15 says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, after the wars, rumors of wars, famines, global chaos, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads them, let them understand, and he issues a warning to those who are in Judea at that time." The question becomes, what time? And that is really something essential for us to understand, because in Matthew 24:32-34, he says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place." Well, if Jesus was speaking to the generation that was listening to him give that prophecy, we have a problem, because that generation has passed away and those things haven't come to pass. If we, as futurists, those who believe most of Revelation prophecy is yet to come, are correct. And so there are those who would say, amillennialists and others, that would say we are wrong on this point. The problem is they don't see the difference. They look at Luke as the same text, telling the same story. But Luke, when it begins to mention, "And there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven," Luke says, "But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you." So this group of signs, Matthew says, "Then after these things this will happen." Luke says, "But before these things this will happen." And if you look where Jesus is speaking in Matthew, he's speaking in one place where he's speaking in Matthew. He's speaking to a different group at a different time, at a different place when he's speaking in Luke. So I want you to outline the differences and become familiar with it. When we get to those places, Jesus says in Luke 21:30 through 32, when they are already budding, you will see and know for yourselves the summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till these things take place. And people get confused. What are we talking about? How can a generation not pass away? So I want to break it down very briefly. Luke versus Matthew, and understanding the differences between the two, Luke's audience is Christian Gentiles. Matthew's audience is the Jews. Both focus on the same group of signs. Luke is focused on what happens before these signs, as I've just showed you. Matthew is focused then after these signs. Luke is happening at the temple prior to Jesus going up to the Mount of Olives. That's what its text tells us. Matthew is recounting what happened when Jesus spoke to Peter, James, John, and Andrew privately on the Mount of Olives. Different audience, different place, different sermon. Luke is referring to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD that was yet future in his day. Matthew is a prophecy about the abomination of desolation that will take place yet future in a third temple that remains unbuilt. Very key distinctions that if you don't pay attention to, you can build a bad eschatology on. So let's break it down how it looks visually. You have Luke 21 and you have Matthew 24. And in there you have wars, famines, earthquakes, rumors of wars, global chaos, etc. That's that group of signs. But because Luke says before these things this will happen to you, we have the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and when Luke says this generation will not pass away before they see these things, it was the generation of his disciples that lived to see the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. John went on to 95 AD, etc., in order to see that. Jesus' words were correct. It's just he was speaking to one generation that would see what would happen before those signs. Because Matthew says, and then after this you will see, or then after these signs you will see. And then he speaks of the abomination of desolation that will take place. Well, it's very interesting that in Matthew's account, he mentions another term that prophecy buffs are familiar with that Luke fails to mention because he's not talking to a generation that will see it. And that happens to be the 7-year period of time called the Great Tribulation, or the time of Jacob's trouble. And it is the people that experience persecutions and see the abomination of desolation after these signs that will not pass away until they see the great desolation, or the great tribulation, the time of Jacob's troubles. 2 different generations, 2 different time periods, 2 different prophecies, 2 different destructions, but people get it confused and they wind up with bad eschatology. Does that make sense? Okay? So I just wanted to familiarize yourself with that. I know that's not exactly on target, and it was a little extra I had to push in this morning. But when I begin talking about that stuff, we will take time. We will do a session where we just go through all of Matthew and we go through all of Luke, verse by verse. But I wanted you to get familiar when I say the Olivet Discourse is, that you know what I'm talking about and why there's a distinction there, because most of the people that do not believe that the book of Revelation is talking about yet future prophecy miss the distinctions that you need to understand in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Is that fair? Okay? So with that said, let's go ahead and take a break.